guidelines put forward in the texts and in Islamic history look like? What would that be? What would that be? So when I went there, I said, actually I don't think that's insignificant. I think the critique may be true to some extent. I think there's an argument for it, and I'll get into why I think it might have some validity in a moment. But I also think that there are people that are conscious of that. It's not that, all these smart guys running around in Malaysia thinking about this stuff. It's not that they're oblivious to the fact that that interpretation is possible. And it's not that they're in fact sympathetic to this critique. They're aware of the critique. They're sympathetic to it. So what I decided to think about, the research that I did in Malaysia was really dedicated to three, I think, central questions. One was Brother Rehan's question, what is Islamic finance? And I think that's not an easy question to answer. Two, what kind of alternative does it offer to conventional finance? And three, what are the debates in which Islamic finance experts themselves are engaged as they seek to develop this alternative to conventional finance? And as I said, to come back to some of the things I was alluding to earlier, the methods that I used were anthropological methods. They were methods about there were methods that would seek to address this not from an abstract perspective, not from a removed perspective, not looking at a whole bunch of numerical quantitative data, but actually trying to go talk to the people, figure out what they thought about it, how they viewed these problems, and how they viewed these questions. And I think this is actually quite unique, because most of the people that are actually doing research in Islamic finance are doing it from one of two perspectives. Either the perspective of economics and finance, on the one hand, or the perspective of Islamic sciences on the other. And I don't do either. I don't do macroeconomic modeling or even microeconomic modeling. I don't do quantitative research that you might find in economics or finance. And I'm not an expert in any of the Islamic sciences, tafsir, fiqh, sharia. I don't speak Arabic. I wish I did. I'd like to learn. I don't read Arabic. But what I do is I have qualitative methods that actually take what, and this I think is the real strong point of what anthropology does, is it takes the questions people themselves are asking and tries to put them in some sort of coherent analytical frame, right? And so what I tried to do then was understand how these questions about Islamic finance were being posed in situ, in their original locations, right? And in so doing, understand Islamic finance from the perspective of those who practice it and are seeking to develop it. So, what did I find out? Well, let's get into that for a moment here. So, the interesting thing that I find out, I think this is actually one of the really interesting questions. I think Brother Rehan, in his excellent remarks previously, alluded to this. But I think the central debate today in Islamic finance is how to facilitate the provision of capital without resorting to interest, right? In other words, how do you make capital available for investment, for economic growth, for business development, without having to rely on interest-bearing loans, right? To me, that's the central question, right? And what does that look like? What does that look like in practice? And so what I'd like to now do is explain the two primary methods that Islamic financial institutions use in order to resolve that problem. And I think this what I was mentioning earlier will kind of come into perspective. So in Malaysia today, the predominant form for the provision of capital, for actually enabling businesses to access capital without resorting to interest, is something called the Al-Iman contract. And there are a variety of contracts that are very similar. Brother Rehan alluded to one earlier in his remarks called the murabaha. They all work essentially according to this basic strategy. So what the bank or the financial institution will do is it will take an asset, say a computer. It'll take the computer and it'll say, I have maybe Brother Rehan come in, he'll ask for a loan. He'll say, or he won't ask for a loan, he'll ask for some capital to invest in his business. And I'll say, okay, fine, Brother Rehan. Here, I have this computer. Why don't I sell it to you? And you can, don't pay me now, pay me later. Pay me later. You need, say, $1,000. I'll sell this to you for $1,100 on a deferred basis with a markup. So I sell this to you for $1,100. Say it's worth $1,000. I sell it to you for $1,100, but you pay me over 12 months or 24 months or something, right? And then I need this computer for my business, so I don't really want to sell it to him. So then he turns around, maybe a few minutes later, we finish the contract, we sign the papers, finish everything, and then he sells it back to me for $1,000 on the spot. So then I give him the $1,000. Now, what has happened? Well, he's deferred his payment for the computer for $1,100. Then he'll pay me over a period of time in the future, 12 months, 24 months, whatever. But he's now got $1,000 to go out and invest in his, what kind of business are you running?
Pharmaceutical.
I was thinking something similar, like a food truck, but he wants to be a pharmaceutical executive. So he's taken it and he's gone and he's invented some new drug with it. But, and then he'll pay me back. Well, what's the critique here? Well, the problem with this contract is that the payment and the markup is often indexed to the prevailing interest rate. And because the banks are often subsidiaries of conventional banks or linked in some way to conventional banks, the rate that they're charged, the rate that this deferred payment plus the markup ends up being, is essentially the prevailing interest rate. So a lot of people have come along and said, well, sure, there's no loan there, there's a sale, there's an actual tangible physical asset that gets exchanged between the two of us, but it's kind of like a little bit, maybe that's not such the best way to do it, because it starts looking like interest. It starts operating, you're still operating within the interest economy. You're still operating, what is it? How do they find out what the markup rate is? Well, they go to something called CLIBOR. What is CLIBOR? It's the Kuala Lumpur Interbank Offered Rate. Has anyone heard of LIBOR? Raise your hand. You've heard of LIBOR? LIBOR is the London Interbank Offered Rate. It's basically the prevailing interest rate that the banks charge each other for loans. So people said, well, okay, that meets the letter of the law, but the question is, does it meet the spirit of the law, right? Does it meet the spirit of the law? So, the bankers, many bankers, not all of them, but many bankers really like this contract. Anyone want to take a guess as to why they like it?
It's the same thing.
It's the same thing, right? They're familiar with it. It's easy. It's like, oh, well, we do this thing, we have a sale, but it's basically the same thing, Their computer software that's running all their back office operations, don't have to change a thing. You just keep your old system and whatnot. So, okay, so a lot of people say, this is why the guys like Mahmoud El-Gamal, like Timur Kuran, they come along and say, see, it's just the smokescreen. It's just Islamic veneer. A veneer that isn't really any different than conventional finance. And that's why I think there's some truth to their validity. But it's not just the critics outside in the United States, at Duke University, at Rice University, who are making this critique, the thing that I found when I actually went over to Malaysia and I interviewed people is that they're actually aware of this. They see this as a potential problem, right? They see that that critique, that criticism, those questions, those are not illegitimate questions, right? And so, the people that are interested in reforming Islamic finance says, aha, there's a better way. There's actually a better way to do this. And what is the better way? Well, one of the things they call this, they say, well, this, might look like a sale. This kind of contract, the Al-Iman, the investment-based contract, it might look like a sale, but in fact, it's debt-based. That's the term they would use. They call it debt-based. Well, it's still debt-based. There's still debt in there because you're creating this, essentially a debt, right? When I've loaned Brother Rehan this money, or sorry, I didn't loan it. When I sold him this computer and he paid me back on a deferred payment basis, and he was walked out of the financial institution with my $1,000, I've created a debt. On paper, it's a sale, but in practice, it's debt-based. They say, aha. They say, look, that's still basically conventional. And you just use LIBOR, you just use CLIBOR, you just use the federal funds rate to figure out what your profit rate is going to be, what your markup is going to be. Say, aha, well, there's a better way. Well, what is the better way? Well, they say the better way is what they call equity-based finance. Equity-based finance. And the equity-based finance is based on investment, right? It's based on investment rather than creating this obligation, right? It's based on investment. So, how does this work? Well, one of the contracts, there's a few of them, but one of the very early contracts that was used, actually even before the revelation of Islam, back in the, what's today the Arab world on the Arabian Peninsula, something called the Mudaraba. And there's all kinds of contracts. There's another one called the Musharaka. But these are these equity-based or investment-based contracts. And they work according to what is actually fundamentally, I think, a different economic logic. Right? I'm going to try and explain this to you now. So you have a mudarab. And what is a mudarab? Anyone know? What is a mudarab? I'm sure there's some Arab speakers in here. Yeah?
Yeah.
What is a mudarab? What is a mudarab?
It means a street fight.
Does it?
Yeah.
Well, it also means an entrepreneur. Entrepreneur, right? A mudarab is an entrepreneur, right? The mudarab is the entrepreneur who engages in the mudaraba. Now the mudarab comes and he says, I have this great idea. I have this great business idea. I'm going to invent a new iPhone app. I'm going to invent this new iPhone app, and it's going to make this excellent new communication product. But I don't have any capital. That's my problem. I've got this great idea. I got no capital. What do I do? Well, the mudarab says, what I need to do is go find an investor. I need to go find an investor. To invest in my company that's going to make this wonderful new app that's going to solve all these problems and create a brand new social network. So the investor says, oh yeah, this is a great idea. I think this is excellent. Now they could do this thing where they sell the computer and there's this transaction and it looks, maybe it looks like it meets the letter of the law, but not maybe the spirit of the law. Or they could do it this way, which the investor says, okay, good. You're a smart young guy. I know you seem very motivated. You're, or maybe it's a woman, right? You're a smart young woman. You're very motivated. You want to start this business. You want to build this iPhone app. I like you. I'm going to invest whatever you need, $1,000, say, maybe $10,000. I'm going to invest $10,000 in your company, and in return, I'm going to own a share of that company. I'm going to own equity in that company. That's why it's called equity-based, right? I'm going to own a piece of it. And what does that ownership mean? Well, it means whatever profits you make, I'm going to take a percentage of. And they agree on the percentage. It could be 10%, 20%, 30%, however. They negotiate. They find a fair resolution to what this contract is going to look like. And they say, okay, fine, we'll do it that way. So the investor gives the mudarab the $10,000. And the mudarab goes out and he puts his or her team together. They create this iPhone app. And it does phenomenally well. They put it on the iStore. What is that thing called? App Store? I don't know. I don't have an iPhone. So I'm the last person without a cell phone, right? I'm still in the 20th century. But it does fabulously well, and everyone's happy, right? The mudarab takes their whatever percentage they're entitled to. The investor takes whatever percentage the investor is entitled to. And they both make profits from this venture. The mudarab manages it, and the investor just kind of takes the profits, maybe gives the mudarab some advice, whatever. The entrepreneur some advice. Well, okay, so that sounds great, right? But what if the app fails, right? Maybe no one, it turns out it was a bad idea. Turns out no one bought it. Or maybe it had a virus in it, right? And the virus made it a failure. Well, this is where the mudarab is actually quite risky. And there's a potential who bears the loss if the business venture fails, if the commercial venture fails. Well, the investor bears the loss, right? That's what happens, right? The mudarab is not alone. The mudarab is not obligated to pay back the principal. The investor has come into this contract full aware that he or she might make a lot of money, or they might lose a lot of money. And they have to accept that under